The Free Press has just put out a podcast series called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, obviously author of the famous Harry Potter books, the immortal Harry Potter books. And they have released the first 2 episodes. They are going to continue rolling out episodes over the next few weeks or so. And I listened to both of the episodes. I think so far it is quite good and quite worth everyone's time. If you want to go to thefreepress.com, I think it's thefp.com, and listen to those podcasts. But of course, just to give some background as to what exactly the controversy is around J.K. Rowling and her stance on trans issues, we're just going to take this just as very sort of crash course, if you will, here. So there was an article that came out, Creating a More Equal Post-COVID World for People Who Menstruate. And J.K. Rowling, this was in 2020, quoted, "People who menstruate, I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Wumbin, wimpin, womid." She, of course, was referring to women. And then she followed that up with, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. The idea that women like me who have been empathetic to trans people for decades, feeling kinship because they're vulnerable in the same way as women, i.e. to male violence, hate trans people because they think sex is real and has lived consequences, is a nonsense. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I do not believe it's hateful to say so." All right. Now, what she's referring to, and this, they get into detail about this in the first couple episodes of the podcast. She was a battered wife who fled her husband and raised her first child on her own, on welfare, and became this author of unprecedented success and fame. And so in that sense, being a woman, being a female, really did inform her life's path, right? I mean, if that history weren't as it is, there'd be no Harry Potter. I mean, which means the world we live in would be much different. So that's what she means there by saying being female really informed who I was, because she channeled a lot of the grief in her life from losing her mother and obviously being on the run from a violent husband into those books. And that's one of the reasons why they resonate with so many people. Not really with me. I don't really dig them myself, but anyway, that's for everybody. Everybody can love them if they want. No intention of interfering there.
I like them.
You like them? Russell's a Harry Potter fan? All right. My wife's a huge Harry Potter fan, and several of my friends are. I'm just not a real fantasy fan. But anyway,
I'm not like a fan. I'm not like running around to conventions with a fuck wizard hat on, but I like the books.
Yeah. He likes the books. All right, fair enough. So anyway, that's what she means by that. And, that initial tweet thread clearly did not display a hatred or resentment of trans people. It is just an expression that, of course it means something to be a biological cisgendered woman. This is not only mainstream, this is foundational to most people's understanding of feminism, right?
Right.
That is what it meant to be a feminist until apparently June 7th, 2020.
So the context of that is that tweet thread was actually not the first time, right? So a lot of it was when she first defended Maya Fosteda with her case. And, there's this whole lead up sort of following Magdalene Burns, who's, now deceased. So there's, so there's sort of those rumblings for about, I think a year or two before she actually came out with that thread. And so there was a lot of speculation and drama around her beliefs. Like, again, just like policing stuff. It's so silly. But I think the context has to count, which is that Maya Fosteda was actually going through her tribunal at the time. And it was J.K. Rowling's support of Maya that was actually, I think, the major cause of people being upset, not necessarily what she said. Again, I've tried to reverse engineer this stuff to try and understand because what we're seeing with J.K. Rowling is also the big old double down that happens when someone enters this debate and they suddenly just, you know what I mean? Like that, she sort of felt that need to advocate and double down. And she hasn't necessarily said anything wrong, but there's a whole context to this and history with the whole dynamic of this. It's just messy. And it's just like, there's nothing on face value that she says that is incorrect, but there's other sort of, again, it's not just freedom of speech, but also freedom of association that is at threat here. It's more the fact that she was sort of hanging out with certain people who were challenging, who are slightly more extreme in their views. So
yeah, she was a coddler, as they would say.
Yeah. A coddler, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
So I just wanted to be fair, in the interest of fairness, lest the chat get upset and assume that I'm, in one tribe or another. But it's not a coincidence that one of the biggest, most full-on fandoms of the internet is associated with this, which is that the parasocial component, the fact that, like coming out of Tumblr, there's a whole historical thing here, the intensity of the Harry Potter universe. You're going to, certain people have been sort of radicalized into, for lack of a better word, into this sort of feel that they kind of go overanalyze these things. The whole shipping and the fan fiction communities and all those things, they get very intense about these types of things. And that's going to result in like a massive upset when your hero, like that the research indicates that, but when you're upset by a hero or a celebrity, you take that as a personal attack on your identity as well, right? So it's not a coincidence that those two things are occurring at the same time.
I think that's going on, but I think another dimension of it, there's somebody with a YouTube channel who was both a Scientologist and trans, who their YouTube channel talks about how similar the experiences were, because their tactics are very similar. Scientology has the principle laid down by L. Ron Hubbard, which they claim to have disowned, but there's reason to believe that's not true. Fair game. So if anybody is attacked Scientology or is an enemy of Scientology, you can do anything to them, right? You can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you can just destroy their entire lives, you can frame them, whatever. Any way that you want to attack them, you can attack them. The activist community is very much the same way. They don't really care about what's true. Any fair reading of J.K. Rowling, she is clearly not transphobic. She has questions about preserving spaces for biological women that are exclusive to them.
Just one of them old-fashioned dick-hating feminists, Yeah.
And as somebody who has a history of being battered, that's part of what she argues, that a lot of women who have experienced that don't feel comfortable in those spaces having somebody with a male body, however you identify. And this is where the whole activist effort becomes so Orwellian. That's the reason they cannot allow conversation and debate. And that's what this is really about around Rowling. They need to take her down because she's opening up space for a discussion they don't want people to be able to have, because it's a discussion about 2 + 2 does not equal 5. You can identify as a woman. That doesn't make you a woman in a literal sense. It just doesn't, and it never will. You're never going to be a biological woman who has had the experiences of a biological woman. There is a difference, as demonstrated by the trans New Jersey inmate that just impregnated 2 women with, quote from the authorities, her penis. You are never convincing most people that that is a rational formulation. And Hogwarts Legacy was just released, and this kind of, to me, runs in parallel with what happened with the New York Times. Look, they pushed all this too far, and now the backlash is coming. They tried to shut down that game, and the sales are through the roof on that game. You have a lot of people playing that game who don't even game, just as a statement to basically, because where do you go to vote against this? Well, it gave them an opportunity to vote against it by purchasing that game. So really, that's the essence of it. They're trying to fair game Rowling. And that's also for the same reason Scientologists do it, so that everyone else is going to be scared. If they can take down a billionaire author, how can I speak?
Yeah. But let's not also remember that there are always, when we're talking about a franchise like Harry Potter, that as an asset is immensely valuable. Like if you look at some of the business movies, you know, like you go, okay, I'm not conspiratorial, but you can see where interests can all collide at once, not just pharmaceutical, but, you know, the media sort of creating this shitstorm of cancellations, but also the fact that this is a multi-billion-dollar franchise that people, you know, want to try and decouple from her because she controls how it's used. She controls how it's licensed. And so I think, again, it's not the just asking questions thing, but it's also, I think we need to be very healthily skeptical about, you know, trying to pull her rights away. I mean, when you see these rumblings, this is where you go, is this a disinfo campaign, the most sophisticated disinfo campaign of all time? Because you start to see these patterns of language where they start to go, she no longer owns this thing, it's ours now. And that they sort of manufacture these little arguments in the community that then become law, like the stochastic terror. I track that one as well, where they start here, but they keep repeating. And eventually it enters the mainstream and there becomes an actual conversation about whether J.K. Rowling owns her IP. And I go, that's very, you know, and I go, it's not, it's an interesting thought to have, right?
If you didn't have a pattern with these activists doing this to everyone,
that's the pattern that I've tracked.
Think there was something to it. Yeah, I mean, you don't.
You sit there and you go,
this doesn't require a corporate conspiracy. This is
exactly. But interest.
This is what they do, and you know, this is one point I want to make when I look at a lot of this. You know, I remember when JFK Jr. died. And, you know, Gen X was so desperate to have its own JFK moment that you had these morons out there crying in front of the camera as if this had the significance of the death of JFK, talking about what he meant. He was a spoiled rich kid who took a plane up when more experienced pilots told him not to and got his poor wife killed. He was nobody to celebrate. You look at that and you look at the event that it was based on, and you say, wow, man, this country has really jumped the shark. So you look at a lot of these things and you look at their antecedents. You look at ACT UP. You look at the gay rights movement. You look at the civil rights movement. You look at Malcolm X. You look at JFK. You look at
televangelism.
And then you look at this now, and it's a pale shadow of what came before, and really it's a much inferior imitation of something that was much more profound and much better thought through and much less cynical in its tactics.
But that's because it's commodified. So I think that because I've come from the marketing, all I see is marketing funnels everywhere online. So I go, okay, you know, there's lots of different phenomena at once happening here that are somewhat detached from the issue. It doesn't matter what the issue is. There's a funnel that's nudging people in varying directions. When I'm not talking about conspiracies. I'm saying that these things are just the bots nudging, mass reports, all these sorts of things, marketing firms, reputation management, all those sorts of things. It's actually more of a perfect storm. And that's why I say this stuff is just lots and lots of different individual issues that where interests align. Like, so the pharmaceutical business is interested in this happening. Sure. Media is interested in that. The activist is interested in building clout and getting patrons. And so there's lots of different, you know, in international relations, no allies, only interests, right?
Yeah, but there's also, I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think there's a broader transcendent sort of dynamic at play also, which is a distorted perception of what the stakes actually are. And this is what the podcast sort of gets into in episode 2. It kind of brought me back in time to the late 90s and the early 2000s, where you really had a Christian fascist movement in power. George W. Bush won re-election.
Just to be clear, this is the free press is running a podcast This is the first sit-down interview she's ever given on this subject. Go ahead, Keaton.
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, you had a Christian fascist movement in power. George W. Bush, despite starting the Iraq War, won re-election by having his campaign team bring up gay marriage as a ballot referendum in the state of Ohio. They won re-election despite destroying the whole fucking world based on ginning up anti-LGBT, or in this case, just I guess LGB sentiment, right? Yeah. In the heartland. You had people, these very same people had their eyes set on J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter franchise. You had preachers going up and saying parents have a responsibility to protect their kids from Harry Potter, because if your kids read Harry Potter, they're going to go to hell and you're not going to see them ever again when you go to heaven. Right? I mean, this is the level of sickness, of sick, evil shit that you were talking about. Right. You had these people in power. They had every branch of government post 9/11. They were on a rampage here. You don't have that now in the same way. And I feel like a lot of the Gen Zers who act like J.K. Rowling is this symbol of theocratic fascism because she fired off a tweet that says, I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. If she is your vision of the theocratic fascist enemy, that is just born of a certain ignorance of very, very recent history. And a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds are ignorant of that history through not necessarily any fault of their own. They were, some of them, not even born when that was happening. There are some people my age who were not as tuned in to what was going on in the early 2000s. I was a politically conscious kid. They don't know that history, right? And so they don't have a sense of who the actual enemies are here, and they don't have a sense of the fact that these fascists, these theocrats who are actually out to control people, right? For those in the chat, no, Russell's not out to control people. You actually had 20 years ago in this country a movement of fanatical right-wing Christian lunatics who were out to control people in a very, very fundamental way in terms of burning Rowling's books, banning their books, banning gay marriage, right? These people were on the march, and she was in their crosshairs. So she has gotten it from both sides of this culture war. But I feel like in order to really view her with the level of vitriol that a lot of the activists view her now, you have to not really be aware or have a real sense of the danger posed by the very people who you now lump her in with, who were her sworn enemies not even 20 years ago we're talking about.
Right. Well, this is why I'm always saying on the show, I'm a little bit older than you, kid. This is why this world is so maddening for me. Because my entire life, those were the censors.
Right.
Those people.
They were literally burning books.
Fanatic, the Billy Grahams and the Tammy Faye Baker, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Those were the enemy. Those were the censors. Those were the ones who wanted to stifle speech. I can't even wrap my head around having to fight people over basic concepts of speech and open debate who, in essence, are left in terms of my values. I'm for trans rights, so it's not quite like it was fighting with the Christian right, where like I was against everything that they believed in. But you have this group that, the objectives I don't disagree with, but the angle they've taken on it and the approach and the tactics and the underlying philosophical take on what the basis of those rights are is extremely dangerous to a lot of the best ideas that our society holds. In fact, it's dangerous to the very ideas that have allowed this rights movement to get as far as it has.
One of the premises that I think is, again, this is just a sort of US versus the rest of the world thing, because you got the two parties. You got your left party and you've got your right party. And under no meaningful definition are the Democrats or left wing in terms of like a global You know what I mean? Like,
for sure, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So I just want to, and I think that they're ultimately pro-capitalist. The elephant in the room is obviously class analysis, socialist analysis here, which is that capitalism is adaptive, and so eventually, like the words around corporate social responsibility and those things. There was a lot of one thing about that time was that there was a lot of upward pressure for corporations to get their shit together and be, corporate social responsibility was the buzzword in the 2000s, right? And so maybe because I was on the marketing branding side, I saw more of these things, but it's just content. They see this stuff as content.
Of course, yes, no.
And brand
that
positioning
hasn't changed since the early
PR.
2000s. No, not at all.
And yeah, exactly. So, and I think a lot of the activists see it as content. And a lot of this stuff is just in a system where people, especially young kids, they're super online. I've seen it with my own kids, super online. They only, exist within these little bubbles. They're looking to their leaders. Like the timing of Rowling's coming out, so to speak, on Twitter, don't forget, it was in the middle of 2020 when these kids were at home. Their parents were probably fighting. There was a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of trauma and a lot of fear. Like one of my criticisms is of the timing, which is that parasocial, it's not necessarily a logical thing, it's emotional, which is with parasocial relationships and fandoms particularly, is that they were tremendously hurt and let down when in a situation where kids watched their leaders, they watched their parents, they watched, the government, they watched everyone just fuck up like everything and leave them go. And that's just as just generally.
Right.
And then you've got vulnerable kids who, think the answer to that, they find the only answer that they've got is a marketing funnel that tells them that they're trans and that's going to fix all their problems. I mean, this just seems like again, that's one slice of one thing, which is where I can be critical of Rowling and her timing and her not taking her platform, like with the gravity and time, those sorts of things. That's a valid criticism, I think. And but then there's the substance of what she said, and then there's the context of what she said. They're all very different things, and then you've got different types of trans and different types of this. It's just so many different things. And I think the problem with this debate is that everyone's lumping it into ones and zeros, for and against, with us or against us, funnily enough, that sort of stuff. And I think that's one of the things where it's like, well, it should be up to the team who are at the mercy of regulation and very serious consequences if they fuck up. So that creates the disincentive to be, malpractice. And then obviously those other things, economic, fostering family stability, all those beautiful material things. And, ultimately leaders to get their shit together so that people aren't drawn in by celebrities as leaders. But, that's the bigger picture stuff.
Well,
anyway, that's just my little speech. Sorry about that.
The reason they were so disappointed by Rowling is because she's a very doctrinaire liberal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't buy that she conceived Dumbledore as gay. I think she retconned that for the fans to give the fans that representation, or LGBTQ audience, and fine. But this is part of what's crazy, and it goes back to the Glenn Greenwald thing. The left is a movement that seeks to make itself smaller. You got someone like Rowling who agrees with you on 99.9% of what you believe, who just, maybe thinks that people with penises shouldn't be in women's prisons, and transphobe!
If you've been on the left,
if you can't,
I could tell you a time. I could tell you a time when the Green Party nearly split in half over pizza. That's just what the left does. This is why that whole leaving the left thing is silly too, because if you've been active in the left, you know that the perfect is always the enemy of the good, always. And the smaller the disagreement, the bigger the fight. Like that's generally that's a thing about the left, right?
It's the life of Brian thing.
Yeah. It's always
people's front of Judea. We're the Judean people's front. White.
Yep, seriously, pizza nearly split a political party in two.
Please clap.